On my screen, the slides are still up.
Trying to figure out how to stop sharing on WebEx. Give me just a second.
Kathy, we hosted a meeting on WebEx yesterday and found out that they made some changes and updated.
Oh,
Another one of the helpful updates to these apps. And so things that used to work one way now work a different way, and things that used to be easy are now hard. So
got it. Okay, well, I will do my best to manage through who is with us and who is not with us. And if folks can provide some assistance, Amy, if I miss somebody, if you could help me, that'd be great. Director Benner, if you would just acknowledge you're with us today, that'd be great.
I'm here.
Commissioner Reitman.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Director Bateman.
Afternoon, I'm here.
State Forester Mukomoto.
Here.
Commissioner Jackson.
Present.
Acting Director, almost, Palmeray, excuse me.
I'm present on behalf of Kurt Melcher this time and myself next time.
Great, thank you, and congratulations. Senator Dembro.
I'm here. Thank you, Kathy.
Commissioner Apter.
I'm here. Great to see everyone.
Commissioner Batowski.
Here.
I'm getting just a little. Director Woodcock. Director Woodcock, it looks like you might be on mute. Commissioner Ross, excuse me.
I'm here.
Director Strickler.
I'm here.
Welcome. Director Sharpoulos Hansen. Who's here, but
Kathy, if she's not able to join, I'm here. Thank you, Judith Callens, ODA.
thank you, Judith. Your director is here, but maybe is either just on mute or has stepped away for a minute. Representative Helm.
I'm here. Hi, folks.
Hi. Acting Director Page.
Here. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I am just looking back at my list. I think I may have missed a couple of the newer state agency directors. Director Stolfi, did I see your name when I was? Director Sophorn?
Yeah, this is Mark Brady. I'm here on behalf of Support from Business Oregon.
Thank you. And I believe we will have the State Public Health Officer with us shortly.
Actually, Chair McDonald, I was just going to pipe up. It'll be actually our overall agency director, Sejal Hathi. Dr. Sejal Hathi will be joining hopefully any moment now.
Great, thank you.
Chair McDonald, my apologies. I had some mic difficulties. My name is Brian Veldheim. I'm acting on behalf of Chair Stolfi for DFR.
Great, thank you.
And Chair McDonald, this is Dan Elliott with Oregon Housing and Community Services. I'm representing Director Bell today.
Thank you.
Chair McDonald, this is Colin McConaughey with Oregon DEQ. I'm here on behalf of Director Felden.
Thank you.
And
It
Chair
is-
McDonald, I don't know if you can hear me now. Apologies. Andrew
Yes.
Stolfi, DCUS Director, State Commissioner. Sorry, I was having IT issues.
No worries. Thank you and welcome. And if there are no other commissioners, I just wanted to.
Chair McDonald, this is Zach
I
Baker.
was- That's where I was going, Zach.
Just wearing a new hat as a policy advisor at Public Utility Commission and sitting in for Chair Decker today. Chair Decker was not able to make it because she's running a PUC public meeting at the same time. So she sends her apologies and happy to be back in the mix.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I was just going to vote to you.
And Chair McDonald, I don't know if you called my name yet, but Kristen Sharon from PG.
Thank you. I missed you, I think, on the first pass. Welcome, Commissioner Sharon.
Good to see everyone.
And Kathy, this is Lisa Sharplow Hansen. I had to answer the door and I'm back.
Excellent. Welcome. Good. Well, one of the things that we decided as we have a longer list of attendees that, you know, if the folks that are kind of standing in for agency directors wouldn't mind identifying yourself rather than us trying to manage it behind the scenes, because in some agencies send more than one staff person in addition to the director or instead of the director. So that'll just help us in our meeting management and roll call, which has gotten a little more unwieldy. But welcome, everyone. I am excited to turn us over to the agenda that we have. But before we do that, I just wanted to give a couple of updates and give my fellow commissioners the opportunity and the directors on the commission and legislators an opportunity for a few short updates. One, you will recall that in December, DEQ presented on the development of the consumption-based inventory, the update of that inventory. And at the time asked if the commission would like to form a committee to advise them on that work. And I want to thank Commissioners Jackson, Ross, Apter, and Potowski for agreeing to serve on that committee. The first meeting will be held in early to mid-April. And the intent is to have a few meetings of that committee, and then the topic will come back to the commission in June or July, and then we'll be able to take it up before the DEQ provides the report to the legislature. So very excited to see that work moving forward. Second, we will be sending out the announcement for the opportunity to apply to be on the next Natural and Working Lands Advisory Committee in the next few weeks. So for those of you who are interested in serving, the members of the public who are interested in serving on the committee, please do stay tuned for that announcement. In addition to posting it on our website, we will send the announcement to tribes, natural resource agencies, and interest groups so that they can help us get the word out and spread that information out to the broader public. Commissioners Reitman, Apter, and Ford will be joining me to review and select applicants as we did the last time we went through that process. There is a little different makeup of the commission and a more limited number that's recommended by the legislation. So if you want to get a refresher on that, you can look at House Bill 3409. So those are my two updates. Do other commissioners have updates they want to share? Not seeing any hands.
I'll just jump in, Chair McDonald.
Great.
This is Commissioner Apter. Just wanted to share that the Oregon Environmental Council is currently hiring for a transportation program director. And I will drop information to that position description in the chat. But of course, a very important, exciting role, given we know transportation will be a big priority and topic of interest, especially this coming session. So really eager to get a strong slate of candidates for that role. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hi, this is Janine with the Oregon Department of Energy. Since Nora started, I will share that ODO is hiring a senior clean energy policy analyst, also a very important role with the clean energy transition. So I will drop a link to that job posting in the chat as well.
And we're also about to release the senior climate policy analyst to help with the OCAC.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Other updates? Okay, with that, I can turn things over to Amy. Just a reminder that in January, we heard a report on and endorsed the Priority Climate Action Plan developed by DEQ and the Oregon Department of Energy. And since then, they've been hard at work developing a follow-on proposal to EPA that's due April 1st. And so Amy's going to tell us just a little bit about that work and what they will be submitting.
Yes, thank you, Chair McDonald. So as many commissioners probably remember, at your January meeting, we provided you with an update on our Priority Climate Action Plan to EPA. And that plan was submitted on February 29th, one day early, which we're very proud of. So this plan was developed by DEQ with in partnership with ODO and with contributions from some other state agencies as well. And so priority climate action measures that are identified in the state's Priority Climate Action Plan are now eligible to seek funding through the Climate Pollution Reduction Implementation Grant program that's being operated by EPA. So just a reminder, the Priority Climate Action Plan and therefore the measures that seek funding through the CPRG for implementation grants are designed to fund implementation ready programs. So the priority measures that we included in our Priority Climate Action Plan expand upon existing state programs. And these programs are plug and play programs. They're scalable, they're replicable, they're ready to go. And we determined that they all will have meaningful impact on greenhouse gas emissions by reducing or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So we are working with DEQ to develop an application for a climate pollution reduction grant. These applications are due April 1st. And this is just a list of the measures that were included in our Priority Climate Action Plan and are therefore eligible for funding through the CPRG program. They are very competitive grants, so we aren't positive that we will get a grant. We're very hopeful that we'll get a grant. And so I'll just run through these measures very quickly. These are all of these measures were presented to you at your January meeting as well. So we have 3 priority transportation measures, which include incentives for light duty electric vehicles and chargers for low and moderate income households, medium and heavy duty electric vehicle grants and rebates, and then medium and heavy duty EV charger grants as well. There are 4 measures included for the building sector. First, incentives for new energy efficient housing. This would be new housing units that complies with the state's REACH code, which is a voluntary code that requires buildings that achieve that code to reduce energy use by at least 10% below buildings constructed under the base building code. Then we have incentives for early and voluntary adoption of commercial building performance standards. These rules are currently under development by ODO. their heat pump incentives. These are our community heat pump incentives program and our rental heat pump incentives program, both of which are administered by the Oregon Department of Energy. And then weatherization assistance for existing residential buildings. And then in the materials and waste category, we have 3 measures. First, grants to reduce embodied carbon in buildings through building reuse and space efficient housing. Second, grants for food waste recovery and infrastructure. And third, grants for landfill gas controls. So all of these measures are eligible to seek funding through a CPRG implementation grant. We're in the process of developing this application. We're still making final determinations on our funding requests. So we're not ready to share any information on the amount of funding that we're intending to seek for any of these measures or for the program as a whole at this point. But we are planning to come back to you next month and give you a full update on our application. Happy to answer any questions if any commissioners have them, while also acknowledging that I may not be able to provide full and complete answers at this time.
Any questions for Amy? Thank you.
Chair McDonald, I just wanted to add one more thing, which was to compliment the DEQ staff and to Amy in particular, and Morgan and Whitney, and who just did really yeoman's work pulling this off in a very, very short period of time. It's very complicated to put together a grant in a couple of months for $200 million. They did a great job, and I think I hopefully will be really successful.
And you're going to get it in a day early as well? Just kidding.
Maybe 2.
Oh, good. Excellent. Well, thank you. It's great to hear about that. It's a huge opportunity for the state to move some things forward and take advantage of the funding that the federal government is making available through the EPA. So really great to see Oregon stepping up on that. One thing of interest to folks that may want to see what other states are up to in terms of their priority climate action plans, they are all posted on EPA's climate pollution reduction grant pages, or you can navigate to all the state plans that were submitted, as well as the plans that were submitted by metropolitan areas and tribes. So great to see a lot of those available to get ideas of what folks are working on in different states. Any last questions for Amy or Alan? Okay. Then we can turn things over to Todd Cornett from Odo. He's going to talk to us about the energy siting facility process in Oregon. You may recall the discussions that we had when we were developing the roadmap to 2030 really emphasized the importance of being able to stay on track with the programs that were already in place. And this is particularly important, this topic, given the clean energy law, the state's clean energy law, House Bill 2021. And so I thought it would be good for us to do a quick refresher on the process that facilities have to go through to be approved in Oregon. And then I think at future meetings, it would be great to hear from the utilities and from the Department of Energy about the state energy strategy and how that may be all influencing how the state addresses the Clean Energy House Bill 2021. So with that, I'll turn things over to Todd.
All right, thank you, Chair McDonald and members of the commission. If you can, yeah, perfect. Actually go back one slide, please. Yeah. So yeah, my name's Todd Cornett. I'm the Assistant Director for Siting at the Oregon Department of Energy. And so I manage the Energy Facility Siting Division. I am also the Secretary to the Energy Facility Siting Council. So I'm going to give you a pretty high-level overview of the state siting process today, but happy to follow up with any questions later on or provide me more detail at a future meeting if you would like. Next slide, please. So you can see the statute on the slide. So the state siting of energy projects goes back to the 1950s, but the program that we have in place now actually started in the early 1970s. And it really, what we do is incorporated in the policy on the slide. And that's essentially to balance the need and value of large scale energy projects. So for the production and transmission of energy, as well as to evaluate and mitigate the potential negative impacts of these projects to both the built and natural environment. So these are some of the bigger infrastructure projects in the state. So in addition to being important and valuable, they could also be quite negative and impactful if not done correctly. So next slide, please. So some of the basics about the program. So the Energy Facility Siting Council is a 7-member governor appointed and legislature confirmed board. They're volunteers. They are the decision makers on all applications, amendments, and rulemakings. The siting division, or one component of the Oregon Department of Energy. We have 13 positions, and we do the majority of the analysis, writing, coordination, day-to-day work associated with reviewing projects and ultimately making recommendations to the Energy Facility Siting Council. So the process is designed to be a one-stop shop. People oftentimes talk about it takes a long time and and it costs money, but it's also because we incorporate all the state agency reviews, local government reviews. It's a much more significant and robust process than the local government process. And so the values are that it's all done in one place. That eliminates duplication of process, eliminates different timelines, different appeal processes. And even if those individual reviews would have resulted in all approvals, those could be contradictory in terms of what gets approved and maybe what the conditions are associated with those various approvals. So the idea is that this is a one-stop shop. It does make it bigger and more complicated, but it also, there's a lot of value in doing that as well. The tracking for the public is easier. The participation by state agencies. So as part of our process, we have what are called reviewing agencies. Those are pretty much all of the natural resource agencies, state agencies, all the tribal governments that are identified as could be affected by the project or a particular project, as well as the local governments within whose jurisdictions the project is located. Those are all designed to be part of our process. We rely upon them as subject matter expertise, and we rely pretty heavily upon them and coordinate significantly with them. Our process is standards-based. So what that means is we have a set of standards, and it is the burden of the applicant to prove through the record, through the information they provide on the record, that they meet each of the standards. And one of the differences, people often will compare us to NEPA. One of the elements of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act at federal government level, is the lead federal agency can propose the project in a location different than the applicant actually proposes it. For us, we can't do that. So we have to review what is submitted, and that either meets the standards or it doesn't based upon the information. So when you look at our process, some of the language that we have, I think it confuses people because some of it sounds like the NEPA process, but when you actually look at it, it functions much more like the Oregon's land use system. Oregon's land use system is a standards-based process. Applicants have to submit information. Again, they have to prove that they meet those requirements in order to get an approval. So we're much more oriented to the state land use system than the NEPA system. Once a project is approved, if it's approved, they are given, the developer is given a site certificate functionally it's a permit, but it does have some different legal implications. It's more of a business contract between the state of Oregon, the Energy Facility Siting Council, on behalf of the state of Oregon, and the certificate holder. And then finally on this slide, we are fully fee funded in terms of our review process. So applicants pay for the entirety of our cost. That includes staffing, the Department of Justice, any costs associated with the Energy Facility Siting Council, and any reimbursement to state agencies, local governments, and tribal governments who help us in our review of projects. So next slide, please. So while people mostly focus on our applications and amendments, there are really three main components of what we do. And the first is applications and amendments. That's where we spend probably the majority of our time, and most people sort of see us doing that. But we have two other components as well. One of those is compliance. So from the point that a project is approved all the way through the time that it is decommissioned and removed from the landscape, we evaluate all the conditions associated with each phase: pre-construction, construction, operation, and retirement. And our compliance staff evaluate each one of these projects at least annually to ensure that it is complying with the conditions of approval. And you can see in the background slides, sometimes bad things do happen with projects. And that can take more time and more effort to kind of deal with those incidences that occur. And thirdly, we have our own rulemaking program. So the Energy Facility Siting Council has different rules than the Oregon Department of Energy, and the authority of those rules fall to the Energy Facility Siting Council. So we have our own rulemaking coordinator, and we have a pretty aggressive rulemaking program to evaluate different either procedural or substantive rules on an annual basis to try to make our process more clear and better for all participants. Next slide, please. So before a state jurisdictional facility can be built in Oregon, the developer has to apply for a site certificate, but which facilities and what size of facilities come to the Energy Facility Siting Council are basically established through the definition that it is in the statute that's on the slide. So ORS 469-300, 11 defines energy facilities, and the list of the facilities that are subject to FSEC jurisdiction is quite diverse. There is a lot of variation, and each one of these standards, or each one of these projects or types of projects, has different thresholds. And I will get into some of the more significant ones that we're dealing with in the next couple of slides. And I do have a slide on battery storage, which is not FSEC jurisdictional, but there's some movement on that recently that's probably worth noting. Next slide, please. So over the past several years, there has been some change in the thresholds related to solar development. So you can see on the slide, you have the location of where a project would be. And since the majority of projects, solar projects are located on exclusive farm use owned land, the jurisdictional thresholds are really oriented towards productivity. So the higher productivity the land for agriculture, the quicker, the smaller the project before it comes to the Energy Facility Siting Council. So then you have high value being the most significant, farmable. So think Eastern Oregon, winter wheat would be kind of in that farmable area. And then really non-farmable ground could be based on soil type. It could be a different zone. And you can see prior to 2019, in order to come to the Energy Facility Siting Council, the first two categories, anything over 100 acres would come to us. And then in the last one, anything over 320, there's been a significant movement in the last few years. So all the way till now, post 2023 legislative session in House Bill 3179, not a huge difference in high value, still pretty small threshold before it comes to FSEC at 240 acres. But now you can see on that farmable ground, it's gone from 100 acres to essentially 4 square miles, meaning local governments then have the ability to review projects up to 4 square miles on farmable ground, and then non-farmable ground, local governments have the ability to review projects up to 6 square miles before it would automatically come to the Energy Facility Siting Council.
Do you see developers following those and staying with the counties, or do they tend to default to the Energy Facility Siting Committee more often than they may be required to?
Yeah, the statutes allow for opting in by the developer. So developers can opt into FSEC even though they're less than these automatic thresholds. And then local governments, primarily counties, can have some ability to defer to FSEC. Thus far, none have in either circumstances. So we've yet to see that.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. All right, so you can see this slide breaks down kind of, these are only state jurisdictional, these are not local government. So I can't tell you exactly what the amounts would be for local government, but for FSEC jurisdictional facilities, these are the numbers. So the first state solar project was approved in 2018. And now really that's mostly what we're seeing. There's not entirely what we're seeing, but mostly what we're seeing are new solar projects. So you can see the total of active projects, and this is, you know, under either in operation or currently under review, about 4.7 gigawatts of projects that are currently active for FSEC. And then just for information, you know, what does that equate to? About 73 square miles of occupation. You know, and the difference between, say, wind facility and a solar facility is solar facilities are basically a fence line around the entire project. And so it's entirely converted. Whatever it was, it's now largely, you know, entirely fence line around a solar facility, whereas wind projects, you can farm right up to the base of the wind turbine. So quite a bit different in terms of the footprint impact. And then you can see the inactive one. So since we started seeing solar projects, we've already seen a couple either withdrawn or expired. And in fact, the very first project that was approved that I referenced in 2018, that was approved. It had a 3-year timeline to begin construction. They didn't begin construction. They requested a time extension. They didn't build the project or begin construction within that second 3-year time frame, and that project just expired. So under their amendment, after 3 years of approval, they had indicated in their justification that they didn't have a power purchase agreement, and then at this point, they've just let their project expire. So some projects move forward, some move forward very quickly, some don't, and there's an example of one that didn't move forward. Next slide, please. All right, so getting to the wind and transmission thresholds. So for a wind facility, it would be 150 megawatts nameplate capacity before it came to the Energy Facility Siting Council. So, and that's really, you know, each wind turbine has a maximum output on it. So it would be the cumulative maximum output listed on each wind turbine. So for example, you know, turbines are getting bigger and producing more power. And so if a project was proposed at with turbines at 4 megawatts each, at 38 wind turbines, it would become FSEC jurisdictional, just to give you an idea. And then transmission, so it's all three of these. So for a transmission line to be jurisdictional, it would have to be greater than 10 miles, equal to or greater than 230 kV, and then also in more than one jurisdiction. So all three of those have to be hit before it comes to FSEC. Next slide, please. So I like this graphic because it kind of shows you going back in time, the size increase of wind turbines. So back in 2001, turbines were about 242 feet tall. Now they're 650 feet tall, and you can see that sort of related to a couple of, the U.S. Bank Tower in Portland at 536 and Multnomah Falls at 620. So these are quite significant projects in terms of the size, or they are increasingly. But just sort of interest, the Energy Facility Siting Council actually approved the first state jurisdictional wind project in 1983. So, the review of renewable energy projects, a lot of people think it's a fairly new thing, but it's not. So FSEC approved its first wind facility in 1983. This was in Curry County. There were a lot smaller wind turbines at the time. It was never actually constructed, and the approval expired. But the history of it goes back quite a ways. So now you can see the total amount of active projects, about 3.5 gigawatts of wind. And then over the, primarily since the early 2000s, the number of projects that have either been approved and let their approvals expire or withdrew, or built less than what was entirely approved, almost equals what is actually active, about 3.5 gigawatts of wind energy. So that gives you an understanding. Next slide, please. So getting into the battery storage question. So battery storage is not FSEC jurisdictional by themselves. So the standalone battery storage wasn't and is still not FSEC jurisdictional, but just about every project that we have now has a battery component. So a new wind project, a new solar project, or even amendments to add solar to wind typically always includes battery storage. So you can see in terms of the active amounts of battery storage, about 4.5 gigawatts of battery storage is currently active. Most of that is currently under review. A little bit is operation, but the majority is under review. And during the last legislative session, House Bill 4015 was approved. Previously, battery storage wasn't even defined in statute. And so I think there was a kind of a lack of clarity about what the regulatory path is. I think there's still some work needs to be done on that. But currently, based on that bill passing, battery energy storage systems are defined. They're defined in FSEC jurisdictional statutes, but they're not by nature or by definition FSEC jurisdictional, but they can opt into FSEC. That was what the developer community had advocated, and that's ultimately what was passed.
And Todd, when they are standalone on agricultural lands, do you happen to know if they're a conditional use in agricultural lands?
Yeah, and I think
it has to go through permitting.
Thank you, Chair McDonald. Yeah, I think it's not clear, but I think what everybody anticipates is that it would not be a conditional use, that it would be, and excuse me for getting into land use a little bit, but there are two categories of uses allowed within the exclusive farm use zone: type 1 or sub 1, and then type 2 or sub 2. The first category, the sub 1 uses, have very few standards that are specifically listed in statute. And then the sub 2 uses are conditional uses. I believe that everybody anticipates that a standalone battery energy storage system would be a utility facility necessary for public service, which is a sub 1 use.
Great, thank you.
But it's not explicit. So I think there will probably likely be future legislation to help further define that.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the FSEC process is a standards-based review. I'm not going to go through any of the details of these, but this lists the 16 general standards that apply to every project. Now, the applicability of these standards, sort of modulates based upon the project and the location of the project. So they don't all have to meet the same sort of level of justification to meet each standard. It really depends upon the circumstances. So, if you're in an industrial zone in an urban area, your fish and wildlife standard is going to be pretty easy to meet. But if that, a different project in pristine habitat could impact, significant wildlife, it's going to be a much higher burden and a lot more effort that's going to need to be met. So I'm not going to spend any time on this other than to say, we work with, our reviewing agencies, the state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and we rely upon them heavily to help us where we don't have the subject matter expertise in some of these areas. Next slide, please. And then briefly, I'll just run through our process. So there are 7 main steps in our process, starting at the notice of intent. Really, that's a high-level overview. The applicant must submit, about 100 pages of desktop-level analysis of what the project they're proposing and where. And then we send that out for public comment. We have a public information meeting in the vicinity of the project. We seek input, from the public, from the reviewing agencies. We do our own analysis. And based upon that, we issue the project order, which is really just a set of standards that particular project has to meet. What are the analysis area distances? How far do they have to evaluate the project per standard, in terms of what needs to be submitted in their application. Then they have 2 years within which to submit a preliminary application. We evaluate that to determine whether it's complete or not. And a complete application just means that we have enough information to review the project, not necessarily to recommend approval. And so we work heavily with the reviewing agencies when we're reviewing it for completeness. Once it's deemed complete, we also provide notice. We have another public information meeting in the vicinity of the project to try to prepare the public to participate in the next step, which is the draft proposed order. And that's functionally a report. It is the department makes an analysis of, does that proposed project meet each standard or not? So we have findings of fact, conclusions of law, conditions of approval. We provide notice of that. We have a public hearing. That public hearing is in person, in front of the council, in the vicinity of the project. And so we get comments on, how did we do? What are you thinking? Based on those comments, we make adjustments to that, which is then the department's second recommendation in the form of the proposed order. And we've made adjustments to any findings or conditions. And then ultimately, it goes to a contested case. So each application has a mandatory contested case where the Energy Facility Siting Council appoints an independent hearing officer who runs that. And so we, the department, are a party. The applicant is a party to that. And then any of the members of the public who commented at the draft proposed order stage, if they commented and they're still not satisfied that their issue was evaluated and resolved, they can request that issue be evaluated in that contested case by that third-party hearing officer. And then ultimately, I'm not going to go through the steps in that, but there are a whole set of steps associated with that contested case. Then once that's concluded, the department's proposed order and then any evaluation that's done by that hearing officer on those issues goes to the council for their final decision. So they evaluate everything on the record. They make their own final decision. And if the project meets all of the standards, then they approve it and then they issue a site certificate. And what I don't have on the slide is the appeal path. So by statute, the appeal path for a final decision of the Energy Facility Siting Council goes directly to the Oregon Supreme Court, and they have 6 months within which to issue their final decision. And the reason being is the record is really complete at that point in time, because the only issues that are eligible to be challenged are in the contested case, and there's a pretty complete record that was established by the hearing officer. That's what gives them that 6-month time frame within which to issue a decision. And just to give you an example, so the Boardman to Hemingway project had a lot of parties in the contested case. I think it ended up having, 3 or 4 parties who appealed to the Supreme Court on a host of issues. And even with that huge record, the Supreme Court issued their final decision in 4 months rather than 6 months. And that was really, I think, a function of the record being as complete as it was. Next slide, please. So I'm not gonna really spend much time on this, just more of a reminder. And I know, or I found out recently, you did receive a overview of the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment tool. This is just a plug to say, please go check it out. It's a great tool. It has a lot of value. You can do pretty significant assessments of, a particular location, whether it's a good solar or wind resource, what are the potential implications based upon different resources that are out there. It's a very sophisticated tool. It also includes all these state jurisdictional energy facilities, the boundaries of those as well. So just encourage you all to take some time and play around with the tool. It's a great tool. And then my last slide is, this was a pretty quick overview. I could spend an entire day going through our process, which nobody really wants. But that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have or come back at any point in time, if you want further details on any parts of our process.
Thank you, Todd. Are there any quick questions for Todd or comments from commissioners or directors or legislators about the process? And
Senator Dembro has a question.
Excellent. Senator Dembro.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Todd, thank you very much for this overview. One of the bills that was proposed this year that didn't make it through was House Bill 4090. That it passed in the House and then it came to the Senate and wasn't addressed in the committee, or didn't come out of committee. And it would have allowed developers to avoid the EPSEC process for projects that were in federal land and had to go through the NEPA process. And this was actually an issue that our environmental caucus was split over. And one of the concerns was that the NEPA process could change, depending on what happens at the federal level. The EPSEC process is one that we have control over, and so there was more confidence in that. But obviously, the push for making this change was to try to expedite the process for developers and avoid unnecessary duplication. And so I wonder if you could just say something about how, in a situation like that, EPSEC would coordinate with the NEPA process to avoid duplication. I mean, is this a serious problem as you see it? Because I suspect this bill will come back, and just to prepare us for that.
Thank you, Senator Dembro. What I'll say is, or I'll start with, is within the EPSEC statutes, there is mandatory language that requires, EPSEC, or at least the Department of Energy on behalf of EPSEC, to coordinate with any federal partners that are also doing a review. So we have a statutory mandate to minimize duplication by coordinating, with the lead federal agency in a NEPA process to use information where we can. So the NEPA process is not the same as the EPSEC process. But we do have the requirement to coordinate with our lead federal agency to minimize any duplication of materials that are submitted that could be used to meet an EPSEC standard as well as a NEPA requirement. So we have that mandate, and in the Code of Federal Regulations, lead federal agencies for NEPA process also have that mandate to coordinate. So we have that requirement. We've done projects, the Boardman-Hemingway project, there was a lot of coordination between the department and the Bureau of Land Management, who is the lead federal agency. When I first got to the department, I was the lead on the Cascade Crossing project. That was a Portland General Electric had proposed a project from Boardman to Salem. They got through the application and then withdrew that project, but there was significant amounts of coordination between us and the Forest Service, who was the lead federal agency. So we have experience, we do that. I think one of the things, just, to kind of respond, that I didn't see during that bill, any evaluation, any testimony. There was certainly some discussion, but nobody had conducted any kind of evaluation to say, what is the FSEC process? What are the standards? What is the NEPA process? What are the requirements? What is duplicated? What is not duplicated? I think people kind of generically said, it's the same and it's the same kind of requirements. And it really isn't. There is a significant amount of difference in terms of ours being a standards-based and NEPA being an impact-based, and what's required to be on the record, how it gets evaluated, how the resources are protected. I think before that comes back and gets evaluated, really some more coordination needs to be done with the federal government to determine exactly what do they do, how do they do that, how does that compare to the FSEC process. I don't think there was really much, if anything, in the way of the record that did that kind of evaluation during that bill, at least nothing that I saw.
Thanks, Todd. That's very helpful.
Sure.
Chair McDonald, I think you're muted still.
Thank you. I just wanted to recognize that Representative Levy has joined us and Director Sajahathi. I hope I said that close to correctly. Welcome. Pleased to have you with us. I was hoping that you may have elevated the director. Don't see that has happened. So if you could make sure that happens, Amy and Abby. And perhaps the same thing with Representative Levy, but let me check. Any other questions or comments on the FSEC process for Todd? Okay.
I do not see any other questions, Chair. And I believe Bobby Levy has been elevated. I'm having a hard time finding the other director, but we will work on that.
Excellent, thank you. Great, so we are a little bit behind time. I think that was mostly a result of just the longer introductory period that we had. I think Todd, you stayed pretty close to on time. So thank you for that. And next we'll turn things over to some information on the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management's evaluation of offshore wind potential off the South Coast. And I believe we're going to hear first from Jeff Burright from DLCD. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Burright. I am the Coastal State Federal Relations Coordinator with the Oregon Coastal Management Program. We're within the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'm here today to talk to you about offshore wind, where we are today, what processes we see ahead of us on the horizon. I want to talk to you a little bit also about why the state has a seat at the table in these federal decisions that are happening offshore and the nature of the state's role there. Talk about the review that is just about on our doorstep that will be here this year. And then at the end, I want to talk about a bill that passed through the legislature this year that is going to introduce a new roadmap process for the state of Oregon as we talk about what offshore wind could mean for the state. So to get started, just a brief overview of the Oregon Coastal Management Program. We are the state's federally recognized coastal management program under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And in that role, we provide support and we implement the statewide planning goals as they concern coastal uses and resources, including the Territorial Sea Plan and local plans. We have the Federal Consistency Authority, which is my role is to coordinate those reviews for the state, and it is the state's seat at the table for federal decisions. And we are a networked program. DLCD is the administrator of the program, but our program has broad participation from 11 state agencies, 8 counties, and 33 cities in the coastal zone. So there are a lot of participants in the decisions that are made on the coast. Now, I want to talk about where we are today. In February of this year, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management finalized their wind energy areas off the coast of Coos Bay and Brookings. These wind energy areas were the result of a multi-year process of down selecting, of winnowing down from some larger areas that were originally proposed. And through a process where they conducted modeling and information gathering, gathered public input, BOEM was seeking to find areas of least conflict that would be suitable or most suitable for issuing leases of the Outer Continental Shelf for the purposes of developing offshore wind. And so in February, they finalized those wind energy areas. And on the same day, they also issued a notice of intent to prepare an environmental assessment under NEPA for a decision to issue a lease. So that process was 30 days for the public comment, and that ended on March 15th. Now, to situate us on a bit of a longer timeline, you can see the arrow represents where we are today. There's been the area identification that has been completed, and that led to those wind energy areas. And you can see this is like BOEM calls it the rainbow chart, the overall life cycle of their leasing and authorization process from beginning to end. And following the identification of wind energy areas, BOEM publishes a proposed sale notice to issue a lease. They then issue leases to developers. And then following a period of up to 5 years or so of site assessment and surveys of those lease areas, and then between those lease areas and shore where they're looking for cable routes, the applicant would then submit a plan to BOEM to actually construct a wind energy facility. So where we are today, we're the wind energy areas. Right out ahead of us, associated with the decision to issue a lease, is the state's first opportunity to review that federal action and to apply our policies and standards to the issuance of the lease. However, it's important to note that a decision by BOEM to issue a lease is not equivalent to giving permission to actually build an offshore wind facility. That would come several years later after these studies and preparation of the environmental documents, the construction and operations plan. After those have had time to mature, those would be submitted to BOEM for their review, and the state would get another opportunity to perform a review. And now I want to talk for...
Apologies for interrupting, but to some extent, the reason for that is that the leases may or may not be picked up by anyone. So, why do extensive analysis until you have a known interest? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that is part of it. And there's another piece of this where there are conversations about community benefit agreements, fisheries mitigation agreements, There's a lot of study that needs to be done to design a facility that could suit a particular environment. And until you know who the lessees are, a lot of those steps just can't be taken. And so the issuance of leases, of all the interested parties that may be out there, people then know whether they're still in the running or not, so they can proceed to those next steps.
Thank you, John.
But it is not permission to go build that. So I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why the state gets to have those opportunities that I talked about to have a say in the issuance of a lease or in the final authorization of an offshore wind facility. And it dates back to the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972, where in that act, it was recognized that the actions of federal agencies can have effects on the uses and resources of the coastal zone that are of interest to the state. And so because of that, the CZMA contains this mechanism that is an example of cooperative federalism, if you will, where the federal government must submit its plans, or an applicant who is trying to receive a permit or license from the federal government must submit their plans to the state that can then be evaluated against the state's own standards for what is an acceptable effect to uses and resources. And that leads to the Federal Consistency Authority that I mentioned earlier. And it was hammered home to me from the day I started that we should consider the Federal Consistency Authority as a coordination tool first and foremost. It provides the state an opportunity to work together with federal agencies and the applicants in an attempt to find projects that can be found consistent with the state's policies. There are different processes that are followed depending on the type of action that is proposed. In the case of this one that is right in front of us now, BOEM issuing a lease for use of the Outer Continental Shelf, that qualifies as a federal agency activity. The state gets to have a 2-month review of those kinds of actions, and we get to evaluate it against our enforceable policies, or those most direct and substantive standards that we have in the state that relate to those effects. And then there are certain outcomes from that review. We can either concur and say, go forth and prosper, what you're proposing is consistent. There's a conditional concurrence mechanism where we can say, yes, if, and that gives us an opportunity to participate in what the final decision might be. If, on the other hand, the state objects and finds that the action just cannot be made consistent with our enforceable policies, that objection for the federal agency activity has a subsequent coordination step with that federal agency, and the project may not move forward. If we object to a federal license or a permit, which would be that down the road decision of whether or not to construct an offshore wind facility, that objection would prohibit the federal agency from issuing that permit or license absent an appeal to the Secretary of Commerce, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. So it provides the state a pretty significant voice in the conversation. I do want to talk about where federal consistency applies. There are often questions about how do we get to apply this authority out in federal waters? And the answer is the CZMA is pretty considers what an effect to a coastal use of resource might be. And the Oregon is unique in that we did some analysis about a decade ago to justify that if there were a marine renewable energy project out to a depth of about 500 fathoms, we can already determine that we see an effect to coastal uses and resources, and the state has automatic review authority for those activities. And once we have that authority, we are able to apply the full suite of our enforceable policies to that action, even though it's occurring outside of state waters. Our jurisdiction extends from the crest of the Coast Range out to the edge of the territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles, and then that extra amount for marine renewable energy projects. And so this federal consistency review would apply not only to offshore facilities, but any onshore activities related to port infrastructure improvements, cable landing, etc. And the coastal effects that are subject to review are similarly fairly broad. They include a wide variety of categories of effects, and they also are permitted to be cumulative or indirect, separated by space and time. So it's a fairly low threshold to bring the state into the conversation. When we perform reviews, those reviews revolve around what are known as enforceable policies. And these are a subset of the state's suite of statutes, administrative rules, local plans, our statewide planning goals, and the Territorial Sea Plan is an important one here as well. From all of those documents, we gather what are those most direct and substantive requirements, and we submit those to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and if they approve those for use in our reviews, they have to meet certain criteria. Those could now be the basis of an objection. And so the identification and development of those enforceable policies is really important to maintaining the state's voice in these reviews. What you see here on the screen is a pictographic map of the different sources of our enforceable policies currently. As I mentioned before, they include our statewide land use planning goals, our Oregon administrative rules that cover a suite of topics from water quality to fish and wildlife protection to habitat uses. We have Oregon revised statutes, again, that are topically based. And then we also have local policies at the city and county level that include land use regulations, comprehensive plans, and codes. And I mentioned Oregon's land use system. We do have 3 statewide planning goals that are, 4 that are specific to the coastal space and that would be fairly important when we consider the review of an offshore wind project. Goal 16 applies to estuaries and could relate to channel modifications or facilities that are along estuaries or the routing of subsea cables. Similarly, goals 17 and 18 relate to coastal shorelands, beaches, and dunes, and those can come into play for cable landings and other such activities. And then goal 19, ocean resources, covers those activities that would occur out in the territorial sea and beyond. And I wanted to highlight one aspect of goal 19 in particular, and that is that it gives a higher priority to the protection of renewable marine resources, i.e. living marine organisms, than to the development of non-renewable ocean resources. And so in the context of goal 19, renewable is more of a biological concept than an energy concept, and is something that must be built into these reviews. The Coastal Management Program and the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, OPAC, oversee the Territorial Sea Plan, and Part 5 specifically addresses marine renewable energy siting. It was originally developed with wave energy in mind, but there is talk about potentially revising it to make sure that the policies that are contained in there are the ones that we want to see when it comes to wind energy. And I'll note that they include some resource mapping, such as visual resources, specific habitat areas of greater interest. Once the state receives a federal consistency review, as I said before, it's a 60-day process normally, where the federal agency would submit to us some documentation that describes how they believe the action is consistent with Oregon's enforceable policies. And they would also use things like a NEPA analysis to provide some additional support related to the effects. There would be a public comment process associated, and we would lead that review, including our many network partners, as we evaluate what has been provided to us and what we know about the action to determine whether ultimately we can agree that the action is consistent with Oregon's policies. And again, as I mentioned previously, we're looking at 3 general outcomes here. And if you look at what's happened in other states, most have tended to result in that concurrence with conditions California is a good example where they said yes if, and they included a number of conditions both related to protecting environments, but also to setting up some working groups that would be having conversations between now and when a construction operations plan is eventually submitted some years down the road. Again, the state gets 2 touch points for offshore wind. This first touch point we're expecting to arrive sometime this spring. And that would be the BOEM decision to issue a lease. And that would then flow naturally into a number of activities on the part of the lessees to go and study those areas that they have now leased as they prepare those documents to submit to BOEM. And so that's touch point 1. Touch point 2, we're expecting will be some years down the road, and that would be the more specific plan of what they want to build, where, and thinking long-term about things like decommissioning, etc. So narrowing in even further on the scope of what we expect to be part of this first review that'll happen this year. We're expecting that within the lease areas, that dark blue box, that there may be some individual buoys that are attached to the seafloor that are collecting meteorological data, sea conditions, doing biological surveys, etc., as well as vessel activities. So geophysical, geotechnical surveys, sonar, doing wildlife monitoring, all of these things that would build into and inform their eventual construction plan. We also expect that there will be vessel activity between shore and the lease block as lessees are trying to find the optimal places where they would run subsea cables from an array to shore. And then that may also include some upland activities such as geotechnical exploration of the beach, looking for places where they might run horizontal cables under the beach and then come out on land. So the scale and the type of activities that we're expecting are ones that I think are less complex in nature than what we will eventually see down the road for this first decision. I also want to show you based on what we know so far, what we're expecting of this first review process that would happen this year. We are expecting that there would be a concurrent review of multiple aspects, starting with the BOEM NEPA environmental assessment up at the top. And we understand that BOEM would be hosting some public meetings associated with that environmental assessment, looking at those activities I just described. BOEM would also issue a proposed sale notice, which would include things like whatever bidding credits they're including with their solicitation for lease and whatever conditions they're proposing to include on any lease sale. And then simultaneously, they would submit to the state that federal consistency review documentation. And we're allowed to have an automatic extension of 15 days on our 60-day review. We've told BOEM to expect that we're going to be requesting that. So we're going to take as much time as we can. There will be a public comment period, and we understand there's an expectation as well for a public hearing, and we're just in the beginning stages of planning out what that would look like. Now I'd like to switch gears. We're near the end. I would like to touch on the House bill that passed through the legislature this year and what it means going forward for those processes that I just described. So House Bill 4080, I would say, had 3 main components to it. The first one was the establishment of some labor standards that would specifically apply to offshore wind projects. In order to become enforceable policies, we would need to have those be approved by NOAA for use, and we don't yet know if those would suit. However, House Bill 4080 also included resources and a charge to DLCD to lead 2 different efforts that are related. The first is an offshore wind roadmap effort, and that would be built on some informal conversations that began late last year in the wake of the BOEM draft wind energy areas, where they received 1,100 public comments, the most of any state that they've received so far. And so a group was brought together to start talking about their values, their interests, their information needs. And out of that conversation was this idea that maybe the state of Oregon needed a roadmap, much like other states who are facing offshore wind development, to identify what those values, interests, and needs are, and potentially recommend some standards that could then provide direction to the state toward the development or amendment of our existing enforceable policies. And so the idea there would be that DLCD would lead a broad engagement effort, a big table approach, bringing in many different communities of place and practice and having those conversations over the next year or so. And with the hopes or the expectation to produce a roadmap document by about September of 2025. Simultaneously, DLCD would be evaluating the enforceable policies that are currently on the books and holding those against what we expect the effects to coastal uses and resources might be, and what we're hearing out of the roadmap conversations to identify where we may have some current gaps or where we may have an opportunity to strengthen or adjust the policies that we currently have on the books to make sure that they are fit to the challenge that offshore wind could bring. And my last slide, just to pictorially show how we see that roadmap process fitting in between now and say 5 years from now. As I mentioned, that roadmap would take about a year, year and a half, built on a lot of engagement and containing strategy language and proposed standards that then could be taken and formalized via subsequent processes, be they agency rulemakings, amendments to the Territorial Sea Plan, local plan and code amendments, or even to the level of statutes in the next legislative session, to then create those enforceable policies. And we're expecting that we would have time to complete all of this before we would actually see that first construction and operations plan for an offshore wind project. So we recognize that offshore wind is coming. We recognize that there's going to be a substantial challenge to the state to evaluate that against our standards. And we want to rise to that challenge and make sure that we're ready for those reviews.
Thank you, Jeff.
I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions for Jeff before we turn to our next presenter? Jason? Well, it certainly seems like a complex undertaking, so I really appreciate how much attention the governor's office and the agencies are putting in, and interest groups and tribes and others are putting into trying to think about how to do a good job of evaluating the process. Senator Denbrough.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, well, first of all, Jeff, I want to thank you for that very clear presentation, and thank you for all the work that you did informing us on, about House Bill 4080 at the time. It was very, very helpful. I think I stole some of your words in my floor carry, so please forgive me, but thank you. One of the questions that has come up is, if the projects are able to go forward, what do we do as a state to make sure that the electricity doesn't just get sent down to California, but comes to us in Oregon? And that may well require us to come up with some transmission infrastructure. And how does that all fit into your planning? there will have to be a parallel process there that will involve EPSEC and everything that we heard about before. What kind of thinking is going into that?
Well, that's probably a question better directed at Jason, who's following here. But I will say that the roadmap bill contained language that was specifically requesting this roadmap group to evaluate standards that relate to energy resiliency, reliability. And so there may be some opportunities there if we determine that we're lacking in certain policies that we could apply, that there may be an opportunity there. But I would defer to Jason for
great
conversation there. Thanks.
Any other questions for Jeff? Great. Let's go ahead and turn things over to Jason.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Is somebody running the slides and I just say next? There we go. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. And I think I'll just stay off camera. It might be easier that way. But I'll try to get through this. It's shorter than Jeff's. I will touch on transmission a little bit, but maybe save your questions for the end, and then we can talk about transmission there. But you know, if something rises to the occasion, feel free to interject and jump in with a question as I go through the slides here. Next slide. So yeah, we can jump to this map here. This is something that Jeff pretty much covered, I would say, the BOEM process. So next slide. And again, Jeff talked about this one. The House Bill 4080 road mapping effort is kind of the big takeaway from that bill. It did do some other things. Jeff did a good job summarizing, I think, everything there. The flag here from Odo's perspective is highlighting one of the provisions in that bill that was dedicated to the energy aspects of offshore wind. And so this will be kind of how the department engages in that road mapping effort, you know, giving input on the achievement of state energy and climate policies, you know, how offshore wind might be of value for increasing energy diversity, reliability, and resilience of the state and regional power grid. Flag the due dates for that are also similar to our state energy strategy, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So next slide, you remember that September 1st deadline of next year. So our state energy strategy deadline is also similar. So I think the thought would be for these two processes to inform each other as best they can, to the extent they can. And so this is our snapshot slide on the state energy strategy, which most people probably have heard a little bit about. So in 2023, the legislature passed House Bill 3630 that gave us this authority. So a year before the recent offshore wind road mapping bill passed, this passed, and this is kind of like a simple way to think of it is just all the energy technologies, you know, and I maybe use the word roadmap, even though it's called a strategy, you know, kind of a similar tact. Basically, we are charged with, you know, leading an engagement and input gathering process with a diverse group of interested parties. And that would include tribes, communities, state agencies, you know, kind of pretty much everybody under the big tent to develop a state energy strategy to identify pathways for achieving the state's energy and climate policy goals. So the scope of this would assess many types of energy technologies, not just offshore wind. So you'll get, you know, energy efficiency, transmission, solar, batteries, the whole gamut is going to be assessed under the state energy strategy. And the goal is to provide kind of a high level strategic guidance for the state, help identify implementation gaps and options to achieve the energy and climate goals, explore technology and policy pathways, and seeks to identify a preferred pathway, potentially that transparently balances all these trade-offs that we hear so much about, you know, when in terms of land use and resource qualities and different things like that. So like I said, the timelines are similar, so we'll try to keep these two processes connected. Next slide is a little bit about, so my last two slides are actually more on the energy sector side of offshore wind and showing folks, you know, what are the other activities, whether at the state level or the power planning, power sector world, like with utilities, what are these other activities going on that are relating to offshore wind off Oregon's coast? So this one is with speaking a little bit about the Oregon Utility Commission, Public Utility Commission, and what it does with our utilities and their integrated resource plans. So what is an IRP? That's literally what it is, integrated resource planning. And that is like a 20-year outlook that utilities do to forecast the scale and timing of what they need in terms of new resources, you know, to meet load growth and things like that, and to identify potential candidate technologies to fill those needs. These IRPs, they're continuously updated essentially. They're on 2-year cycles. So as soon as one is kind of submitted to the PUC, their review process begins, and that takes a while. And then shortly after, the utility is kind of onto their next IRP, like doing the early work on that. And so it's kind of a continuous refresh, basically, of these evaluations. And so what that means is what's identified in the utility IRP 1 year may not match with what's identified in the subsequent IRP. These things can change based on market conditions and a host of other factors, weather conditions, all sorts of things. So for example, a significant change in forecasted load growth or a rapid cost decline from an emerging technology could cause the utility's IRP to change and the resource mix to change from one cycle to the next. And maybe I said this already, but the Public Utility Commission reviews these. And these are, the nexus is really just with our investor-owned utilities. They have the regulatory authority over our investor-owned utilities that serve Oregonians. And the point is to acknowledge whether these plans are reasonable. That's the point of the review process. And the 2023 IRPs for both Oregon's two largest utilities, PGE and PacifiCorp, are nearing the end of this review process. The 2023 IRPs are the first to include assessments of the new resources PG and PAC need to meet Oregon's 100% clean energy goals. So that legislation, House Bill 2021, passed in 2021. And so these IRPs that were submitted around this time last year in 2023 were the first go around and the first pass incorporating the 100% clean energy targets. So these are important IRPs. The PUC is closing up their review processes on them. They haven't issued their final orders, but those are forthcoming. And the whole reason I'm flagging these is because there were discussions that kind of either talked about offshore wind on the outskirts or were directly talking about offshore wind. So for people who are interested in this topic, I wanted to flag this as an opportunity, you know, to learn more about what the utilities are planning for in terms of offshore wind. And those discussions, just high level, they were, you know, the discussions with the PUC and our utilities were around all these challenges to meeting 100% clean energy that we're talking about here at this meeting. You know, whether it's siting and permitting or other technologies that haven't emerged yet fully, that aren't totally commercially available, like floating offshore wind or geothermal or hydrogen, you know, all these other technologies that we're still working on to try to give us all these options to meet our goals. So effectively, long lead time resources was the focus of a lot of these discussions. So like transmission and offshore wind, or maybe nuclear plants or geothermal, like I said, a host of technologies kind of fit in that long lead term bucket. And then I think my last slide is about that question we had with transmission. So maybe this helps a little bit. So there's two activities, I would say two primary activities in the realm of transmission. And this is not focused on anything that California is doing. So California is actively engaged, you know, in transmission planning efforts on their own. I should have said earlier on that the stuff I'm covering here are mostly just Oregon specific kind of forums and things that are looking at offshore wind at a large regional level that Oregon is engaged in. Of course, there's things happening in Washington and things happening in California also related to offshore wind that I'm not covering today. So the transmission example is a good one. I'm not going to talk about anything that CAISO is doing, but these two examples are broader than CAISO. One is this Western Transmission Expansion Coalition. The acronym for that is WESTEC. And so WESTEC is looking at a west-wide long-term transmission planning effort where offshore wind is likely to be discussed and accounted for. WESTEC is a broad and diverse coalition of many, if not all, the significant power sector entities across the West. And this effort was spearheaded by the Western Power Pool. It launched at the end of 2023, so it's kind of almost where our road mapping effort is and our state energy strategy effort are, like in the very early days, not fully launched yet. I think they're still trying to hire some consultants to help inform their process with this WESTEC effort. So it's you know, a good stage, good time for people to, you know, tune into that if they're interested in tracking that effort. And then the U.S. Department of Energy is also leading a West Coast offshore wind transmission planning set of planning activities. One is a study and one is a convening series. So the study launched in early 2023. That's a 20-month study to assess potential transmission options to support a potential long-term build-out of projects, floating offshore wind projects along the West Coast. So not necessarily just off Oregon's coast, but off the coast of California, potentially off the coast of Washington. What would that build-out potentially look like? And then how do you get the transmission necessary to connect that to the grid? And so the other one is a convening series that's intended to kind of align with the transmission study, and that just kicked off in January of 2024. It's supposed to go for about a year. And the point of that is to engage with a broad diversity of parties interested in offshore wind to discuss the aspects of transmission planning, which are most meaningful and applicable to them. So you can kind of imagine that's a big tent as well. Invited parties for that convening series include tribal entities, federal and state agencies, transmission planning organizations, key interested parties such as cable and transmission providers, fisheries, non-governmental organizations, developers, offshore wind developers, utilities, and basically pretty much any other ocean co-user or interested party can come to that. So these are activities that the Department of Energy and other state agencies are at least aware of and are tracking. I think Department of Energy is equally engaged in both these. Other state agencies might be a little bit more engaged in the US DOE effort than the WESTEC effort, but a couple examples of processes that are going on in the world of offshore wind. So that's kind of all I had just prepared just to get through, but don't have anything specific ready to go for questions, but I can do my best to help offer up other information that might be helpful.
Thank you, Jason. Senator Dembro, do you want to do any follow-up?
No, I think that was very helpful, Jason. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to help. Happy to be here.
Any other questions for Jason or new questions for Jeff? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. I do think it would be timely for us to plan to have transmission and regional markets on our agenda in the future, sometime in the coming year. We talked about transmission and regional markets maybe in 2020. So it's been a while since we had that conversation, and I imagine that there's been significant discussions in the interim that might be helpful for us to understand and just understand how all of these things tie together in terms of ensuring that our energy supply is reliable and we're making the best use of the resources that we have to get the smallest footprint we can have of the build out that we will need. So So that's one of the things I'd like to at least consider in the future. Senator Dembro?
Yeah, actually, I did think of a follow-up. Thanks, Kathy.
Okay, great.
And this is probably for Jeff. You know, one of the things people have been talking about regarding the attractiveness of offshore wind on the South Coast would be if it could be coupled with creation of renewable hydrogen, if it could be used to establish that. And I wonder if that that issue is going to be taken up at all in the roadmap, and that I suppose would also require a lot of CZMA kind of analysis about what the impact of that would be. No? Anyway, I'm very attracted to that notion, but I realize it's that there could be challenges.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's an interesting one. You know, there's no reason it could not be built into the roadmap conversations, considering that it could be a product of offshore wind if you are generating new fuels. I think that what I understand of it is that it would require shoreside facilities, most likely, although maybe not exclusively. I did randomly talk to a guy at one of the offshore wind conferences a year or two ago who said that he was interested in developing that on our coast. And I said, well, watch out for tsunami inundation zones. And he said, what? Yeah, let me give you some information. So anything that does involve development in the coastal zone would trigger a federal consistency review if it involves any kind of federal license permit or other authorization. So it, similarly to offshore wind, would need to be found consistent with the state's enforceable policies.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Okay. See any? We are due to take a break. We're a little bit behind, so I'm going to suggest we take a shorter break and come back at 3 o'clock. But that does give us 12 minutes, so not too much shorter break. And then we'll move into the legislative session update and kind of hear how things went in Salem, what the results were during the short session before we move into public comments and wrap the meeting. So thanks to everyone, and let's go ahead and take a break and try and reconvene just a little bit before or at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Abby, can you go to the next slide, please? Oh, next slide. Thank you.
So we have good scenery for our break. At least for long enough so that we can tell that you're back. Then you can turn them back off if you'd like. Just a bit more time. Great. If you're just getting back, if you can turn your videos on so that I know that you're back. We're waiting for a few. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Just a quick reminder before we move to our next agenda item, if you are interested in providing public testimony, please do reach out to Amy or Abby in the ways that we described at the top of the meeting, and let us know what that you're interested in presenting. And then that'll help us kind of manage our time when we get there to that next agenda item. So we heard a brief overview of the legislative session in January, right near the beginning of the session, but have invited Christy Splitt from the Oregon Department of Energy to come and give us an overview of what happened relative to climate-related bills during the session, and then certainly would welcome opening it up to others that might be able to add some information and or perspectives on the session. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Christy.
Great, Kathy, thank you so much. Chair McDonald, I should say, in a meeting, huh? And nice to see you, by the way. So if Abby can go ahead 2 slides, that would be a great place for me to start. Thank you. All right, well, I think I know many of you, but for those who don't know me or forgot who I was since I was last at the commission, I'm Christy Splitt, and I'm the Government Relations Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Energy. And I always like to start any conversation about what's happening in the legislature with the big picture. I think it can be really easy to get down in the weeds or focus on just the issues you're tracking. And I think that actually what's happening sort of overall in the headlines really makes a difference for kind of the tone and tenor of how the issues that you care about most actually play out in the Capitol. So with that said, I just grabbed a few of the headlines from the day that session ended on March 7th to just sort of give a flavor for how the session went. And actually the boldest of them is the one that I think really stands out the most as someone who's been through a lot of short sessions. I think this was my 8th. And also who also has experienced the sort of tumult of the last several legislative sessions. Just that this one seemed to go pretty well as far as the partisan rancor goes. That has been such a big feature of the last several sessions. That's not without exception, but it's certainly the bills weren't being read aloud in the same way they have been for years now, which slows down the process and also kind of like is this daily reminder of the partisan rancor, if you will. Also there was no walkouts or even really any talk of walkouts. It was all very much focused on issues that there was bipartisan support for. So I think that really helped. Those issues were drug policy. For those who haven't been paying attention, there was a lot of conversation about Measure 110 and making changes to that measure, which was voter approved. But the legislature now is kind of having their say in what they think based on seeing it in action for a couple of years might be some changes to make. And that was one very high profile issue. Housing was another issue, and Alexis Hammer from DLCD is going to talk a little bit about housing when I get to my last slide, when I ask for folks in the audience to participate. He's already ready to talk about housing for us. Addressing homelessness was another major issue, and that includes a multitude of related issues, of course. And then a surprise big issue also with strong bipartisan support in the end was campaign finance reform, which has been a topic both at the ballot box and in the legislature for years and years and years without limits actually taking effect. So this is a big deal for Oregon, and I think on climate and energy issues, money and politics, just as they play into most issues, money and politics certainly plays into those conversations. So I think it'll be really interesting to track how that big headline level issue filters down and affects our work in the legislature in the years to come. Those limits take effect next year, so the election this fall, will not have those limits in place. And in fact, there was a large contribution just made that made the news yesterday. So just know that will continue to be the case until next year. So I would also say that while these were the headlines, even when the headlines were not energy or climate in the last several years, often they were, it was still a really big deal issue where there was always some sort of major effort that was happening that was controversial or contentious. And that was just really not the case this year. We did have some energy related bills that were somewhat contentious, but either they passed or they didn't. But there wasn't like one huge thing. Like if you think 2 years ago during short session, we were working on the cooling relief package. We were working on, that was a short session bill. We've had major bills during the long sessions. There was the big climate package last session 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. There was the House Bill 2021 clean energy conversation. So, and then before that, the cap and trade conversations, of course. So I think it was just a really different session than it has been for a while on energy and climate. But there certainly were things to talk about.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Representative Levy has her hand raised.
Oh, great. Thank you. I can't see anybody but the 4 people in front of me. So thank you for letting me know. Representative Levy, did you want to weigh
When
in?
you're done, I just think that the campaign finance bill doesn't take effect till 2027.
Oh, 2027. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I read an
that's the
article and
only
I thought,
thing.
thank you. I think I just read it. When I read it, I thought January 2025. I probably just saw that because that's what I expected, but 27. So we still have a couple of elections.
Yeah,
Thanks for letting
because
me know.
I do
appreciate the
believe on the
correction.
House side, they want to fix a couple of things and bring it back to the governor for signing before it works for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think I just read the article in OPB and I just must have misread the year when I was reading it. I'm not an expert
That's
on it. So
okay.
super
That's
appreciate
okay.
that.
Your legislative session is much more interesting than the one we lived through.
Thank you. All right, so you can go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll get into the energy issues that did come up this session. We're going to sort of talk big picture and then I'm going to just talk specifically about a couple of bills that are sort of, I think, the closest to the work of either this group, this group. So to start with, on bills that I would describe as climate change, and again, any energy bills, climate change, et cetera, but I put one first that is closest to the work of this commission, which is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Goals Bill. That was Senate Bill 1559. This was actually based on recommendations in the roadmap to 2030 that you all adopted a couple of years ago. And these goals made it through committee in the Senate a year ago and then got transferred into that large climate package bill, House Bill 3409. And at the last minute, these goals were removed from that bill. And so Senator Dembro, of course, a member of the committee, hi, Senator, that moved forward, that bill was brought back again this session. And it actually had, diplomatically, I know he's listening, I hope he doesn't mind, it had a rough session. It didn't get scheduled for a work session. It didn't move forward. So this commission has on its to-do list statutorily to continue to recommend adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals that match the best available science. And Senator Golden, Senator Dembro is retiring. Senator Golden has said on the record he plans to bring this bill forward again. So I don't think the conversation's over, and I think the commission will continue to have a role in recommending that the goals be adopted or changed for the state. So just know that that conversation will be forthcoming, I'm sure, at the commission on how to plan for, think about that in the future. For now, we still have the same statutory goals that were there in 2007. So just wanted to kind of start there, since that's a bill that I think is of everything the most pertinent to your work, both looking back and looking forward. But similarly, just as much related to your work is the Natural and Working Lands Fund. This was also legislation that came forward from recommendations from the Oregon Climate Action Commission passed last year. And there's a $10 million fund, and you all got to dig deep in that in the like early winter, late fall, early winter, and recommended it, of course, as you know. And those funds were allocated during this session. So kind of check that box. It's all officially official. And then another major climate measure is funding for heating and cooling relief in Senate Bill 1530. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute in detail. There were also some statutory changes to our programs. I'll talk to those in detail in a minute. And then also a couple of other bills that passed related to energy, or one that didn't. But there was a bill related to energy markets. Sounds like there's interest in talking more about that in the future. There's legislation that will require the state's 2 largest utilities to issue a verbal update to the legislature periodically on progress related to energy markets and how the state and those 2 utilities play in that space. So that is essentially the legislature just wanting to keep posted on those efforts. And then I know we have a member of the commission who was a leader in the next bill, House Bill 4112. This was a second attempt at creating sort of a clean energy technology economic development package. For those who have followed the news, last session, a big deal was the CHIPS. It was the CHIPS Act at the federal level, and then an Oregon CHIPS Act that was sort of designed to create a bunch of incentives and sort of promoting of semiconductor manufacturing in Oregon. And this is an effort that would do that, but for clean energy technology. And in fact, it sounds like that bill will become part of interim work and be coming back again. It seems to me like the primary issue with it, just in listening to the committee hearings, there were some issues and some pieces of it that were not like all kumbaya, but I think in the end it was sort of a money question. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And I actually talked more than I meant to, because I would love it if folks who know more about it that are on this call feel free to weigh in a minute when I give that chance. And we can go to the next slide. Great, thanks. Another big topic that continues to come up related to energy and climate is around energy facility siting. You all just heard about floating offshore wind, House Bill 4080 and the roadmap, as well as there were labor standards and procurement standards in that bill. That did pass, as you know. I don't need to talk about it any more than that, but it was certainly a high-profile bill during session. Battery energy storage systems. This is a technology that has been becoming more and more affordable. As you know, electricity, unlike liquid fuels, cannot be easily stored. Battery storage is a solution for that, an expensive one that's getting more affordable, like I said. And there's now a lot of interest in setting up full-on like energy facilities that are 25 megawatts or greater, that, excuse me, that would be standalone battery energy storage systems. So if anybody clicks on the link for the report that we just pulled together in the last week of the bills that passed and didn't pass this session that related to energy and climate, you'll see a picture actually on the cover. The smaller picture is of one of these types of facilities, the inside of it. So what needed to happen is that right now there's no way that the Energy Facility Siting Council can consider these type of projects because they aren't defined. So they're now defined in the Energy Facility Siting Council statutes. And there's also a mechanism that will allow a developer to either go through FSEC to get sightings, to get a site certificate, or to go through county planning processes in order to get approval and then be built. So it's sort of a choose your own adventure for the developer as of the structure of the legislation at this point. And then finally, another high profile bill was was regarding FSEC jurisdiction on federal lands. I was actually in a different meeting, but heard that you all had a conversation about this bill earlier. So I don't need to go into detail since it was talked about earlier. But I will just say overall that there is so much tension on this issue of energy facility siting and so much conversation. I'm sure that it will be a hot topic again next year. And I just want to be clear that it's just an interesting issue with two sides. There's, and maybe more than that, but there's folks who think that we really need to sort of continue to have really strong protections for a variety of environmental resources before making decisions about energy facility siting. And there's folks who say that climate change necessitates taking a second look at those processes and seeing if we need to streamline them or somehow sort of review fewer things or reduce the public process in order to make the processes faster. So that tension between the two is really interesting. And sometimes it feels like in the Capitol, there's a lot of like one side of that coin for those of us that are working on siting. We hear a lot about the other side of the coin on the folks who want to see fewer projects cited or who want to hold on to that more robust review. So I just think it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, and just kind of wanted to raise the flag that I'm sure it will be a hot topic next session. And then we can go to the next slide, and I'm just going to quickly kind of go through a couple of bills and then we'll turn over to you all. So there was a housing omnibus funding bill. The variety of the money was focused on really specific housing projects or programs or homelessness relief projects or programs. But there was additional funding for programs promoting heating and cooling relief, indoor air quality, and energy efficiency. So we were really excited to see this package come forward. I really want to give a shout out to Senator Casey Jama, who I think as a housing champion really gets it, that we have these issues related to climate change where folks, need to have access to cooling, or we have more extreme weather events. And so we need to sort of be prepared for those. And then also he really gets it too, that heat pumps can be life-saving devices for folks. So it was really with his leadership, and pardon my bulleting that I'm just realizing I did a cut and paste and didn't realize there were extra bullets. So pardon that. But as you can see here, there was a major investment in the Healthy Homes Repair Fund. That was something that the environmental advocates in the Oregon Conservation Network really fought for as part of a climate budget. And then specifically the ones that Senator Jama, I think, really kind of made happen were making sure that the Oregon Health Authority had additional resources for emergency air conditioners and air filters, money to our department for the Oregon Rental Home Heat Pump Program, which is running out of money imminently if it's not just run out today or so. That program has gone really well, very fast. We've gone through $12 million in rebate funding in less than 6 months. And then also the $2 million to the Department of Human Services for warming and cooling shelters. So that's one thing I wanted to quickly highlight as far as a whole bill to look at. And then one more really quick one is our own bill on the next slide. And that's Senate Bill 1525, literally passed the Senate with a floor speech that was good bill should pass. So definitely wasn't very contentious or a high level of interest. It was just one of those little bills. But I did just want to mention it because it made several changes to existing climate programs. And I won't get into the weeds here, but if anyone's interested, you could either look at the report and see those changes. If you have questions, let me know, but just wanted to make sure for awareness, folks know that, you know, we put these new programs in place that are meant to address climate change, and they need tweaking sometimes. They need additional funding. So between these two bills, just kind of wanted to give everybody that very visceral reminder that we pass a bill and then the work isn't done. And sometimes we have to go back or ask for new things or whatever. So with that, we can go to the last slide, which is really about me sort of turning it over to you. And like I already said, I kind of planted a member of the audience. So there's 3 questions. People can raise hands. And since I guess I could pull up the audience better than I have it pulled up so I can call on folks actually. But
I can help
for those
you do that.
Great, thank you. For those who worked on bills this session, do you want to add anything? I know I might have gotten something wrong, like Representative Levy caught, or you might want to add something to a bill that you worked on. Did any legislation get missed? I just kind of grabbed, I think, like my idea of what those kind of top bills were, but maybe I missed something that I shouldn't have that folks want to share today. And then finally, what climate issues do you think are likely to come up next session, just so we can kind of get our thinking caps on as a group about what might be coming down the line. So I'm going to turn things over, but like I said, I believe Alexis will be ready to pitch in first.
Great.
Yeah.
Alexis?
Thank you, Chrissy, and Chair McDonald. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Alexis Hammer. I'm the Legislative and Policy Coordinator for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And Christy listed basically every bill that I would have listed had I been giving a presentation on climate. So I would just want to add one comment, and that it should probably come as a major shock to everyone in this room, sarcasm intended, that we have a housing governor. And for the last 2 sessions, Governor Kotek has made a huge priority out of housing. And 2 bills have really impacted the Department of Land Conservation and Development. One was in 2023, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which is reforming the way that we plan for housing in the state. And the second was the Senate Bill 1537 from this legislative session that does a number of things, but most importantly for the Department of Land Conservation and Development, it includes a new office that is going to be helping cities and local jurisdictions make sure that they're really doing the most they can towards planning for housing development. And the reason I want to prioritize this and highlight it as a climate conversation is that there are really 2 ways that you can talk about housing and climate. One is the energy that you use within a house and the energy that is consumed within a home. And the second is the way that energy is used between homes and other buildings. And that, in other words, in a transportation context. And we have a major imbalance in the way that housing and jobs are located in many communities throughout the state. And this drives our greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. Transportation sector, as you all know, I'm sure, is the largest sector of our greenhouse gas emissions. And if we can do a better job at locating our homes in high priority areas where there are jobs and accessibility to services, we can really make a big dent in our transportation greenhouse gas emissions. And so the governor's housing bills actually have a major role to play in the climate conversation. So I just wanted to elevate that and make sure that we're all tracking that as a climate issue as well, not just a housing issue.
Thank you, Alexis. And I understand the department's getting a large number of new staff, I assume, to take on some of the responsibilities you just outlined.
It is, yeah. We'll be taking on 31 new staff, and have a lot of work ahead of us. So.
Thank you. Back to Christie's point that it doesn't all stop when the legislation is passed. Are there others that would like to speak to the session and bills that you were either
See Nora's
tracking or
hand up.
advancing?
Yeah, Nora's got a hand up, and I know she had a big role in session. Then we can go to Senator Dembro if you want.
Thank you both. Well, I actually first just wanted to comment or respond to Alexis's good comment. I really appreciate you naming that, and hope that housing continues to be, or maybe becomes, a focus of future Climate Action Commission conversations, given, as you rightfully pointed out, Alexis, it just touches so many different pieces of our work at the intersection of climate and justice. And I think I'm very eager to see how the legislature continues to play a role in overseeing, or at least paying attention to how the housing package rolls out, how it might intersect with what I think we're expecting to be a big, transportation omnibus package next year, and its impacts for achieving the other climate policy programs we have already on the books in the state. So just wanted to name that, and would be interested in thinking about future conversations for the commission to stay involved in and attuned to implementation there. I guess just in terms of the broader question, I'll let Senator Dembro speak to, or what I expect he might want to speak to, the greenhouse gas targets bill, but we'll say that we're very eager for that bill to be reintroduced next session. I think folks know it is long overdue for the state to update our greenhouse gas emissions targets in line with the commission's recommendations in particular. So hopeful for that to come back. The Clean Energy Leadership Bill, HB 4112, is another one OEC was closely working on, but alongside many businesses and economic development and entrepreneurs across the state, that is really exciting in terms of thinking holistically about our clean energy economy and making sure that we're helping to increase access to clean technologies like heat pumps, thinking about production of solar and wind parts and components. So hopeful in the long session with a full budget under consideration, we'll be able to get that passed. I definitely have some thoughts in terms of what is likely to come up next session, but I will pause and welcome Senator Dembro to chime in, and I'm happy to share additional thoughts later if there's time.
Yeah, thanks, Nora. Actually, I too was going to pick up on the transportation piece, just to kind of echo what you said at the beginning, Nora, when you told us about the vacancy for a new position at OEC, that next year is going to be the transportation session. And I think, Kathy, as you and staff are putting together the agendas for this commission's meeting between now and then, you may want to think about that, just to help inform that debate when it comes. Great.
I was just going to say, absolutely. It's been on my list for a while. So
yeah. So going to the emissions reduction goals, the inability of it to move forward, I will say I have to take some responsibility for that, in that, there was really no disagreement that we need to update our goals. And really, we never got to the point of disagreement over the goals themselves. We remained mired in, what I consider to be really a foolish debate over what is a goal, what is an aspiration, et cetera. And but having said that, it was generating discord within the legislature, certainly within the Senate. And so going back to the opening comments that were made about the nature of the session, it seemed more important to defer that, to avoid that debate in order to keep the parties working positively together. Considering that, we have updated the goals through executive order, through the governor's executive order, and the change really isn't absolutely needed until 2030. And so there would be symbolic resonance in making that change. It didn't seem that it was worth jeopardizing the session for that. So that's kind of where we landed. But I am very optimistic that those goals will be changed. My recommendation would be that they not be a standalone bill, but they be part of something quite ambitious. And I hope that that's what will happen next time. I do want to say what was interesting and I think optimistic about this session is we have really gotten our environmental caucus going. This is a group of legislators from both chambers, both parties, who are committed to environmental action. And having the overall view of, bills, it often happens, senators aren't really aware of House bills, House members aren't really aware of Senate bills. The caucus has really allowed us to coordinate our work. And of the 8 priorities that we had as a caucus, 6 of them did pass. The 2 that didn't were, the emissions reduction bill and a study bill having to do with the West Side, the West commuter rail, looking at expanding it. That's unfortunate because we did want to get that going in order to be prepared for the 2025 session. So it's unfortunate, but that was just one of the funding bills that didn't make it just because not all things get funded. I would say for issues that are really front and center for this commission, the big failure this session was not being able to put more dollars into the EV rebate program, the Charge Ahead program. That's unfortunate. But hopefully we'll get that federal grant and that will help us to do it. But, again, that will be part of the conversation for the 2025 session. So anyway, Christy, I thought that was a great overview of the session. And you made us look much better than we actually were, but I very much appreciate that.
It's really helpful when you miss half of session having COVID for session like I did. I was stuck home for most of it. So from my vantage point right here, it looked great. Anyway, one thing that you just reminded me to share that I hadn't really thought to share is that funding for existing programs, I think, is going to be like a hot topic next session. Yeah. And I also just want to flag that we weren't working on it, but advocates were working on getting funding for the solar rebate program. That's actually been a really successful program in Oregon, and that program is going to run out of money this summer. So that program will shut down for like a year. And that's just like, it's just like not great, to be totally candid, to have a program that's really popular be down with no funding at a time when contractors, rely on that as a marketing tool and helps folks who otherwise couldn't afford to make that transition. So there's a couple of examples like that where I know folks were working really hard to try to get dollars to those programs and fell short this session that I just kind of want to flag too.
And things are expected to be tighter next session, I think, or the next biennium from a funding perspective. So that makes it unfortunate. What Senator Dembro, I want to just take a minute to thank you for getting us an invitation or informational hearing in front of the subcommittee for natural resources of the Ways and Means Committee. As Christy mentioned, the funding that we approved to go to the agencies as part of the Natural and Working Lands Fund, the agencies got all of the approvals they needed to move forward with the programs that we proposed. And I just also wanted to recognize Representative Levy. I think there was some good discussion, as well as Senator Dembro, good discussion at that committee meeting, and it was a great opportunity to be able to kind of highlight the good work that the agencies and the governor's office did to pull together a proposal and get that in front of the legislative session so that decisions and progress can be made quickly. So I just wanted to thank you again, Senator Dembro, and thanks to you, Representative Levy, for engaging in that conversation. Any other additions people want to make?
I know Chair McDonald, you wanted me to say a little bit about the process toward next session. I also know we're over time on this item, so I'll be like the world's fastest version of it. Agencies right now are working on legislative concepts and policy option packages, generally called POPs, but just budget items for the next legislative session. We expect to be moving toward sort of like a June date by which all of those will be kind of final and moving forward with continued work. So that's all happening right now. Agencies don't know yet which legislative concepts and policy option packages that we can talk about and move forward in the process. So for now, we're all being pretty quiet in agency land while we wait for that process to unfold. So more to come, but by this summer, hopefully we'd be in a good position to share more with the commission.
Great.
And then of course, legislators have their own deadlines and their own budget that they work on as well. So that just applies to the executive branch. And thanks for the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Christy, and I echo the great report. And did want to just give my thanks to those that did have to weather the Capitol under construction and hearings where there were jackhammers in the background, and was maybe not the easiest place to be during this short session, but really appreciate all the hard work that gets done, and especially under such a time pressure in this short session. So thank you all to the great work you did. So unless there are more comments about that, then we can go to the public comments. Abby or Amy, how many folks have signed up for public comments?
So I would invite any members of the public that are interested in commenting to raise your hand now, and we will take a tally of interested parties. So far, we have no hands raised.
Okay.
We have one hand raised. So I will invite Rachel Lydia Rand to speak. I can.
Welcome, Rachel.
Well, I'm not sure I have permission to unmute Rachel. So Abby, you might need to do that for me.
Thank you, Abby.
Oh, I'm Rachel Lydia Rand. I'm running for U.S. Representative in Portland's Oregon Congressional District 3, the seat that Earl Blumenauer currently holds for the third time running here. I want to thank you all for your work that you've done here. I've learned a ton today, and I've taken extensive notes on all these things that you have talked about. My platform is about addressing this climate change issue on the demand side more than the supply side. And I know this, almost everything today was on the supply side. I just want to comment that, I want to challenge everyone here to consider the fact that the demand side of the equation is not a hopeless cause. And I do have hopes that my work will catch on, and I keep on pressing for it. And I'm really dedicating the rest of my life to this effort to address the demand side here, because there's some serious gains that we can make on the demand side. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you for your comments. Does anyone else raise their hand?
We do not have any additional hand raises at this time.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead to our closing comments then and next steps. So as I mentioned at the earlier in the meeting, and we have established a set of regular monthly meetings. We will be meeting the third Tuesday in the afternoon of every month except August. We have asked commissioners to hold from 1 to 5, but don't anticipate that we will need that full block of time at all of our meetings, but just so that we have them. I'm very excited that we'll have this schedule kind of figured out and that we can start to do some planning to look into the next set of meetings through the end of the year. And at our next meeting, we will talk about topics for discussion at future meetings. Some came up at this meeting: housing, transmission and regional markets, certainly the greenhouse goals that we'll want to circle back to, and the note about transportation being on the agenda for the next legislative session. So imagine that we should be thinking about the kinds of topics that we want to learn more about and debate and see where we might be able to land. We do have a report due to the legislature in the fall, and we have included recommendations in our legislative reports in the past. So if we can get to some recommendations on transportation or on the other issues and more, it would be great for us to include those in the report. In terms of thinking about agenda items, staff are going to put together some preliminary ideas about topics for discussion, but I do hope that commissioners and the public will think of additional topics that they'd be interested in having us discuss at our commission meetings. And I would encourage commissioners and the public to look back at the roadmap that we produced last spring, which is posted on our website under the report section. One of the things I think we want to do is really use that as a way to focus some of our attention. Certainly don't want to limit all of our conversations to things that are in the roadmap, but that has a good proposal and recommendations for how we move forward. So I think it's a great place to start. You can also look back at earlier commission reports. The one that we did in 2020, I believe, had a large number of recommendations, perhaps in 2022 as well. So you might want to refresh your memory on those two reports, as well as the natural and working land proposal. One idea that we've been discussing, it would be great to get some input on, is asking agencies to make short, maybe 10-minute periodic updates on their work related to the roadmap and climate change. This won't replace the need to have longer agenda items on key topics that the agencies are working on, but it will help us just to kind of keep track of how things are going and maybe get to know some of the new agencies that are represented on the commission starting in January. So we'll be discussing that. So if you've got thoughts about that and who you might want to hear from, please feel free to bring that to our next meeting. And then just a reminder that we have from time to time invited guests from other states and non-governmental representatives to present on topics. So don't confine yourself to thinking about just Oregon experts that we can draw on, but also if you've got thoughts about expertise or work that's going on in other states that that we could learn about and think about how to use that to best advance the state of Oregon's climate mitigation and resilience efforts, it would be great to have some of those ideas as well. So if there aren't any other public comments or comments on what I just outlined, well, first I'll stop and say, are there any other comments on what I just outlined? Not seeing any hands. Oh, there we go. Director Benner.
Hey, Chair McDonald, thank you. I thought I'd just raise my actual hand. I just wanted to chime in and say I think it would be great to have an opportunity to hear from other agencies who are new and old members of the committee, especially in terms of the work that their agencies are doing on climate change and as they relate to the roadmap. And going back to something that Christy mentioned earlier with existing programs that are running out of funding or need to be reauthorized, I think it'd be really valuable to hear about the progress of those existing programs, especially those that were highlighted in the roadmap, so that we can sort of track how things are going and be a venue to share the successes, because the conclusion of the roadmap is we've got really good, strong programs in Oregon that are going to get us to our goals if they are implemented as envisioned. And so I think this commission has a really big role to play in making sure that we do what we need to do, and we can help communicate that to the legislature and others who may not realize the importance of existing programs. So I just wanted to offer my support for that idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, really important. It was our #1 recommendation. So thanks for emphasizing that. Other comments? Okay, well, with that, I will close the March 19th meeting of the Oregon Climate Action Commission. And I want to just thank all the commissioners and directors, legislators, and the public for the attention that you're giving the commission and input that you're providing to the important work that we're charged with helping to advance.
Thank you.
Thank you.